if they're trying to get somebody to do something, making it super easy or even the default choice makes sense. But that really hasn't percolated to the rest of the world.
You're listening to the Profit by Design podcast, episode 36. You work hard in your business. On the Profit by Design podcast, we ask the big question: what has your business done for you lately? Hi, I'm Dr. Sabrina Starling, the business psychologist, the author of How to Hire the Best, and your co-host on the Profit by Design podcast. Weekly, my co-host, Mike Bruno, and I bring you tips, tools, and strategies from our own experiences and from the experiences of our guests, who are entrepreneurial thought leaders and real-life entrepreneurs, all to support you in making intentionally profitable and sustainable business decisions to live the lifestyle you desire. So profit designers, you know how Mike and I are always asking the big question: what has your business done for you lately? Well, I just want to share with you that one of the coolest things that my business has done for me lately is this podcast, because it's given me the opportunity to interview authors, and it's so fun to read a book and get lots of ideas from it and then get to have a conversation with the author afterward. But there's also something else going on here. On today's episode, the author that we're bringing on is Roger Dooley. And Roger was with us last year as our VIP keynote speaker at Breakthroughs on the Bayou. And Roger presented the concept of friction, which he has now turned into his book that will be released tomorrow. And Mike and I got to read an advance copy of it. But it was really cool to hear him present the concept last year. And then he hung out with us for 3 days. So we got to have several follow-up conversations with him about friction. And he worked with our participants to apply those concepts in their businesses. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but when you go to a conference, typically the keynote speakers will fly in for the conference, they'll deliver their speech, and then they leave. They don't hang out with the attendees, and they certainly don't get into mastermind breakout sessions and go to dinner with all the attendees. But that's what happens at Breakthroughs on the Bayou. So I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to know Roger over the last year and spending the time that I got to spend with him at the retreat. And it is the concepts that he's sharing with you today, I think, are really going to open your eyes to some areas of your business that you might not be paying attention to. And addressing these areas of the business could have a pretty significant impact for you. So with that, I want to introduce you to Roger with his bio. Roger Dooley is an author and international keynote speaker. His books include Friction, The Untapped Force That Can Be Your Most Powerful Advantage, and Brainfluence, 100 Ways to Persuade and Convince Consumers with Neuromarketing. He writes the popular blog Neuromarketing, as well as a column at Forbes.com. He is the founder of Dooley Direct, a consultancy, and co-founded College Confidential, the leading college-bound website. He's been a serial entrepreneur since he left a senior strategy position at a Fortune 1000 company to enter the then nascent home computer market. Roger, it's so wonderful to have you back here with Mike and I. We were all together just about this time last year at the Entrepreneurs Retreat Center, and we had the privilege of hearing your Friction keynote. And now here we are just a year later, and you have your newest book, Friction, coming out the day after this podcast is released.
Right. Well, Sabrina, thanks for having me on. And it's great to be back with you and Mike, even though it is not quite as much fun as being there in person. But hey, this is what we've got, so we'll go with it. And that was one of my first friction-themed keynotes, although it was for a small group, so it was a little bit more interactive than a big-time keynote. But nevertheless, I've continued to refine my ideas since then. I actually had to finish writing the book in the subsequent months, so it's changed a bit, but the basic concepts are still the same.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, our Breakthroughs on the Bayou group we're a bunch of guinea pigs, because I know you came and you tested out Friction with us. I've tested out a lot of my new work at Breakthroughs on the Bayou. And then we have Mike Michalowicz, who comes and he's shared Clockwork and he's working on his next book right now. He shared his ideas with us, and we love being able to help hone and refine. And tell you, I am so impressed that you put this book together in the course of a year, because it is a very thorough, well-researched book.
Well, it took more than a year to pull it together. I've been working on the concept probably 4 years, 5 years. It goes all the way back to probably 2013 when I developed my little persuasion slide framework, which one of the elements of that was friction. And initially, I didn't weight that as being more significant than the others. But as I worked with it a little bit, I saw that eliminating friction was one of the easiest ways to change people's behavior. And sometimes adding friction changes their behavior too, if you need to do that. And
Certainly.
I became more and more obsessed with that particular aspect, and that ended up being the nucleus of the idea for the book. And talked to a lot of people and basically refine the ideas a lot. And I found, Sabrina, that as I went along, it expanded. Initially, I was looking mainly at friction in customer experience and the sales process, the conversion process in digital marketing. But what I found was that it really influenced every aspect of human behavior, and that our performance in organizations was also driven by friction. There's this great statistic from an article in Harvard Business Review that said every year in the United States, $3 trillion of effort is wasted in companies because of things like rules and procedures that are stupid and really aren't benefiting the company, meaningless meetings, emails that get too wide a distribution, aren't important anyway. All these things that happen inside organizations that end up not just reducing productivity, but also reducing the engagement of team members, because I'm sure you are probably not at your most motivated when you are performing a task that you know is not important and is not related to either your goals or the company's ultimate goal, but you got to do it. Those aren't fun. And if there's too much of that, people start leaving.
You know, Roger, you mentioned the word obsessed with friction. And just the brief introduction there that you gave to the concept and the background of why you became obsessed with it really piques my curiosity. But I also know that after Mike and I heard you talk last year, we were both a little bit obsessed with the concept, and it really landed for Mike. So Mike, I want to invite you to jump in here and share what, if you recall, some of our discussions about friction after Roger spoke last year.
Sure. I mean, I think, the biggest thing for me was just again, I think what moved me the most was just, I think a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs, they understand that something's happening around them, but we really can't articulate it, or, it's kind of like the spin on friction, right? And what creates that friction and the behavioral changes in people and how they act. And it was really what moved me. I mean, it was something that I always knew was there, but I couldn't, I didn't know what it was. And then your explanation of it and your spin on it really then opened my eyes to the understanding that if I understand what friction is in different capacities and with relationships with people and business relationships, employees, and how to get people to move away from friction to a better result, it was just a complete eye opener. I mean, it was huge for me. Really huge.
Yeah. And Mike, for me, it was this experience of once I know it, I can't not know it. Or once I see friction, I can't not see it. So after Roger shared this with us, I was seeing it everywhere. And it really started to drive me a little bonkers with my business because, and I think this is a challenge for a lot of entrepreneurs, Roger, is we're in these rapid growth companies and we're working really hard to remove those friction points, but there's so many of them.
Yeah, and often they're invisible. One of the things that drives me crazy are all these user experience things that have been coded into people's websites and apps that, if you are a CMO or, an executive looking at the website and the processes, they look fine. But people don't realize that there's all kinds of little hidden friction elements in there. Just a couple days ago, I was registering for a conference and started filling in the form. And now one thing that Google does is makes it super easy to fill in even long forms. I don't recommend using long forms. The shorter the form, the higher your conversion rate is going to be. But nevertheless, Google uses their autocomplete function in Chrome to make it super easy so that somebody maybe types in their first name and they can autocomplete just about the entire rest of the form. But the catch is the coder has to design it for that. And I bet more than half the time I'm filling out a form on a website or in an app, and it looks perfectly fine. If you looked at the form, it's well designed, attractive, but when it auto-populates, either it doesn't auto-populate at all, so you've got to fill in each little field by hand, or it puts the wrong stuff in the boxes because the coder switched some things around without changing the underlying coding. So you end up with something like your phone number in your email field or something of that nature. In fact, the other day I was filling out this registration form, and every single field was populated with my first name. Every field was filled in with Roger. So, I mean, clearly, and so I ended up having to fill in each form, just each field by typing it in. But that kind of friction is totally pointless. The tiniest bit of effort would have made it so much easier for registrants, for customers to complete that form. And that's just one little tiny example. I find that our daily lives are filled with these things that sometimes you can see outright, but other times you don't really know until you go through them. In fact, using websites, I often wonder, did they ever even watch a new user try and do whatever they want you to do? Because it's so confusing or so, such a convoluted procedure, you just can't imagine that they did any kind of user testing at all, any user observation, or they're using analytics at all to see how people are doing it, because you can see the user experience is horrible, but companies often are oblivious to this. Now, I would say that in Silicon Valley, app developers have caught on to this a lot more quickly than other folks, and they understand behavioral science. Behavioral science has been a big thing in Silicon Valley for, probably 10 years now. So they tend to get friction. They understand that if they're trying to get somebody to do something, making it super easy or even the default choice makes sense. But that really hasn't percolated to the rest of the world.
Well, no. And I can tell you I think 4 weeks ago, I was on a Friday afternoon trying to fill out a membership application to an organization that I'm trying to join. That's very important to me to join. And I wanted to pay them my membership fee, and I couldn't do it through their website. There was a form that they sent me to. It didn't work. There was no place to pay. And so I just left it. Here we are 4 weeks later. That was over a $500 membership registration that they have yet to receive. I'm not sure they will receive it. I still want to join the organization. I have every intention to, but I have that tired brain that you reference in friction.
Your brain does not like effort. And when you have to exert extra effort, it gets fatigued. And, in your case, especially on a Friday afternoon when you're probably already at kind of a low point for cognitive resources,
for sure.
Just that extra effort is too much. And had that organization put a little credit card processing form or even a PayPal link there that would have made it basically an automatic process, because that's another way Chrome eliminates friction is by autofilling your credit card information. It will store everything except your PIN number so that you don't have to pull out your purse or your wallet and dig the card out to remember the 16-digit number on it. It just does it for you. And that makes it so easy for people to purchase stuff. I mean, it's not quite as good as Amazon's one click, but if you're asking people to pay you money, you want to make it as easy for them to pay you that money as possible.
Well, absolutely. And you talk in Friction about the amount of money that's abandoned in shopping carts. Do you have that total?
Yeah, the most recent number I had was from a couple of years ago, and it was $4.6 trillion in abandoned e-commerce shopping carts, which was more than twice the amount of actual e-commerce sales in that same period. So it's a huge amount of waste. And if you think about all the expense that went into getting those people to the website or to the app, the pay-per-click ads, the SEO, the content marketing, the social media marketing, the web design, everything to get the customer all the way to the point of completing the order but not getting them across the finish line. I mean, that is just a staggering amount of waste. And in many cases, it's preventable, because if you dig into the reasons why people abandon shopping carts, most of the top reasons are frictional in nature. There are things like a complex checkout process or a confusing checkout process, having to set up an account to do business with a company, surprise things at the end. All of these things are totally avoidable, but companies don't really key in on that. And as a result, people leave stuff in their shopping carts. And it's really a horrendous waste of money because that customer was almost ready to complete the order, but didn't.
Yeah, it is kind of, I'm laughing because I remember this story you told last year when we were at the retreat about United. You were talking about how they send you an email to log in or sign up for Wi-Fi earlier or do some extra purchases, but then it times you out and you have to keep, logging in again and again, or you put your username in and it doesn't recognize it. And, there's just a lot of frustration around it. And I remember telling a lot of people that story for quite some time. And then I have one question for you, and I know it's probably like a deep dive question, so you don't have to dive super deep, but I'm reading a book called Digital Minimalism.
Yes, Cal Newport. He was on my podcast 2 weeks ago. Great book.
Awesome. So, yeah, it's a phenomenal book. And I have to say, it's enlightening, yet very frightening that, our behavior, our human behavior has been morphed over, the last, whatever it is, decade of everybody being immersed in technology and having all this real-time access to things. And at a high level, so since I think we can probably agree that consumer behavior has morphed and has changed, and even as humans now, we're kind of, we are a little bit different, that we have all this technology around us. So how does an entrepreneur, small business owner kind of grapple with maybe changing some of their processes or the way they look at their customer, knowing that we're kind of in a new world now where people have all these different expectations?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is that you have to be where your customers are and allow them to use the tools they want to. The days of forcing a customer to comply with your procedures, like the situation that Sabrina just described with that membership application, those days are gone. If your customers are using a tool, then you want to be using that tool too. There's a lesson there too. In his book, Newport talks about how these apps are addictive and encourage use. A lot of that is a friction play. They make it really easy to both get on board with their apps, to sign up, to use them, to access them. And then they use other techniques like they trigger you to go back with these little notifications, and they use variable rewards like the number of likes you get or the number of shares you get to keep your brain interested. So they do a lot of things that really turns those apps into slot machines for your brain, sort of, where you just keep pulling the lever and looking for the reward that often doesn't come, but you keep pulling the lever anyway. And I'm not advocating that businesses should adopt those same approaches, but I think we can learn from that. I said that Silicon Valley had become friction aware a lot earlier than the rest of the business world. And that's one reason why they've been able to develop these really successful apps. It kind of stems back to BJ Fogg, who was an early practitioner at Stanford. He developed his Fogg behavior model, and in a class of Stanford grad students, he had them develop apps just as part of the class project. And within a month or two, these apps were generating millions and millions of daily uses. And in fact, a few class members had monetized theirs. One guy or one team was making like $2,000 or $3,000 a day from this app they developed as a class project. And a few people dropped out of Stanford to pursue their business interests. So this is why the Silicon Valley folks got on the bandwagon a lot earlier.
No, I was going to say, so, I'm almost done with the book, but as I've been reading it, and I said it's almost frightening, is that I almost felt, as a consumer, that some of these things are kind of taking advantage of me in a weird sense, right? Because, with that, we were all kind of naive to the whole, explosion of these apps and kind of what it was doing to us and our mind and triggering certain responses. And, like he talks about in the book, how, it's kind of people have now developed more of a positive response to a notification on their phone than actually talking to somebody in person. So to me, that's, is just, it's almost, it's a little sad. It makes me a little nervous, in terms of where the future lies. So do you think all this stuff is, just your opinion, is it healthy, and kind of where does it go from here? I mean, are we looking for a lot more consumer behavior change? Do you think there's going to be a plateau and it'll level out a little bit? Or what's your thought on that?
Well, sure. There's only so many hours in the day, but I think we can look at China as sort of a leading indicator of what's going on, because if we think that we use mobile phones a lot in our part of the world, in China it's even more prevalent. People practically live on their phones. So they do everything on their phones. They shop, they interact, they do. So, I guess you can ask, well, is this healthy? I don't know. If certainly I have met people online that I have not met in person that I really value that interaction. I value their friendship, even though either we've never met or we've met only occasionally at a conference, and the rest of the time we are in contact electronically. It's brought family members closer together. I know when I was in college, you made a weekly phone call home because it was expensive. And, back in the days when long distance was long distance, that was how you communicated. And there was no email, or you wrote letters, but, even then, not that many people wrote letters. So by the time my kids were in school, we had email, and we could stay in touch on a daily basis. And of course, now we stay in touch with our friends through Facebook and some of the other tools to a lesser degree. So to that extent, I think it's a good thing. To the extent that it dominates our lives and we're not getting away from our computer and out into the sunshine, then maybe that's not so good.
I'm sitting here listening to this, and I'm fascinated with the juxtaposition of these two topics, friction and digital minimalism. And Roger, your book is all about how can we remove friction? How can we be more mindful of it as business owners, entrepreneurs, employees, and companies? Where are those friction points, and how can we remove it? Mike, you're bringing up with digital minimalism that there's been many places in our lives where friction has already been removed. Silicon Valley's been very good at it. And we need to be careful. Maybe there are some places in our lives where we need to insert friction for ourselves as some self-protective mechanisms.
Oh, absolutely. Sabrina, one of the top recommendations of habit experts is if you have a habit that you're trying to break or an activity that you're trying to reduce, is to make it higher friction. So like one of the obvious things to do, which isn't really friction related, but turn off notifications on the apps that you are trying to minimize your use of. That'll at least sort of prevent them from interrupting you, but make it a little bit more difficult to use. Don't put the app on your phone. Access it only through your computer, or do some other things. And there are even phone functions, or I guess apps, that will let you control the use of other apps and say, okay, during these hours, you're not going to be able to check Facebook or Instagram or something. So it even works beyond the digital world with eating habits, which I think that eating in a healthy way is one of the things that most people tend to be somewhat challenged with. I tend to consume more foods because they taste good rather than because they're good for you. But there's been quite a bit of research showing that even minor increases in friction, say in an office, moving a bowl of candy just out of arm's reach instead of within arm's reach caused consumption of that candy to decrease significantly. In cafeteria lines, putting the unhealthy items farther back or in an opaque container dramatically changed the relative consumption versus healthier items. Just all these little things are tiny interventions that tend not to cost anything, but can change behavior in a very positive way.
So, Roger, I'm going to have to let my daughters listen to this episode, because this will explain to them why we don't keep candy in the house. Because I work from home. The 2:00 slump hits, and I am right there in my kitchen going for the chocolate. And if it's there, I'm going to consume it.
Right. Well, in the book, I talk about Art Markman. He's a professor at UT here in Austin, and he's written books about both thinking and habits. And his personal downfall were these little pint containers of Ben & Jerry's, which I don't know if you're an ice cream fan, but pint containers... Yeah, they are. First of all, Ben & Jerry's is really, really tasty ice cream. And these pint containers are meant to be something like 3 or 4 servings, if you read the label. But, they're so small, you just kind of take it out of the refrigerator and start digging into it with a spoon. And you reach that point of no return where you're about halfway down and it doesn't look like there's that much left in there, like not really enough to put away. And before you know it, the whole container is gone. And his key insight is exactly what you described, that trying to resist that Ben and Jerry's in your freezer is pretty difficult. Like maybe if you put it in the garage freezer, it'll help a little bit, add a little friction. But the way to really increase the friction is to not have it in the house. So yes, you could drive to the supermarket and get it if you really wanted it, but that's pretty high friction. And most of the time you're not going to do it.
Well, I even had to go so far when I was an employee years ago in a company, and I would make sure that I did not carry change or dollar bills. Back when vending machines only took change and dollar bills, now they take credit cards. So again, that's another friction point that was removed. But I would only carry credit card with me because I would be too tempted to get into the vending machines midday.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and that was a friction strategy. You're right there. It could have asked somebody for change, to borrow some change, but, that would add friction. And most of the time you were dissuaded from doing that.
Absolutely. So I really want to talk from the perspective of the entrepreneur in our businesses and what we need to be aware of in ways to reduce friction for our team members and our clients and customers. Because one thing that I've been observing since I heard your friction talk last year is how easy it is for us to put friction into our processes to deal with our most difficult clients and customers, because we want to, any good student of the pumpkin plan purposely creates friction for those bad little pumpkins that we want to trim from our vine in our business. And we need to be so mindful of not creating friction for our top clients and customers as we do so. And that can be challenging. So I would love to hear you talk about that.
I think the first step is just to be aware of where you might be creating friction and actually observing what customers have to do business with you. I was at a conference in San Francisco, Behavioral Marketing Summit last year, and there was a firm there that offered behavioral services, and they would go in and ask somebody, a new client, well, how many steps are there in your checkout process? And the client would think for a minute and say, I have 3. Then they would actually go in and observe customer behavior. What do they have to do to check out with a product? And they'd find that there are 27 steps because the customer's thinking, well, there's 3 screens, but they didn't count all the clicks, the scrolls, and the individual actions that went into it. So there was a total disconnect. And speaking of disconnect, if you tend to ask companies whether they provide a great customer experience, most will say yes. 80+% will say yes, or we have an above average customer experience. When we ask customers, there is almost reverse of that number. They don't agree that it's a great customer experience. And one way to sort of bring these perceptions together is to actually observe what customers do. And this can be done by actual observation. You can do it if it's a digital process, like using a computer or a phone. You can do it in your own office with a sort of a lab or observation point. You can do it using digital tools to see what they're doing. If it is some other kind of interaction, then you may have to find a different way of measuring it. Instead of assuming that you know what customers are going to have to do, you have to watch them do it, because if you're familiar with the process, you have no idea what someone else is going to have to go through to accomplish that same objective. In the book, I talk about this crazy elevator system that I encountered first in a hotel in Germany that was like every elevator you've been on almost has a very simple mechanism. There's an up button and then down button to recall the elevator, and then you get on and you push the floor button, and you can do that on total autopilot. But this system required you to swipe an access key card near a kiosk at an unmarked spot, select a floor on a digital display, then make a note of which elevator you were supposed to get on. When you get on the elevator, there's no buttons, nothing. It's just going wherever it's programmed to. So if you get on the wrong one, you're going not where you wanted to, but where somebody else wanted to. And you can't change it. Even if you realize you made a mistake, you're going along for the ride. And this was in a hotel where every day you had new people showing up. The hotel had their staff members walk over to the elevators and give them like a 2 or 3 minute training on how to use the elevator, which was the goofiest thing. It made no sense at all. It was unproductive. And even then, I saw guests who had just arrived struggling with it for the first day or so. Eventually figured it out, and it's fine. But for the developers of that system, It's perfectly obvious. They know how to do it. And indeed, after you do it a few times, everybody copes with it. A guest who'd been there for a couple of days would have no problems using it. But it's anticipating the first-time user or that novice user is really what businesses have to do.
Well, and you used a word there that caught me. You said cope with it. And I think that's a key for us to tune into in our businesses is what are the things that we are making our clients and customers and our team members cope with. And I know for myself, I personally became very aware when I brought on my first team member that it was no longer my job to do the thing. It was my job to remove all the obstacles so he could do his thing. And it amazed me how the things that I had just been doing by rote memory, because I've been doing them over and over, when I was training him to do it, there were so many stumbling points and so many things that I said to him, I just kind of need you to deal with this because I'm trying to remove these other obstacles right now. And that part is really overwhelming, that there's a lot that we cope with.
Well, yeah. And I think the key point there, Sabrina, is that you were seeing that through a new set of eyes.
Yeah.
Because you didn't perceive these things as being problematic or difficult because you knew how to do them. But when suddenly you had to explain this to somebody who was new, you started seeing all the friction that was in that process.
Yes. And, that got me thinking about what are some powerful questions that we as business owners can hold on to help us be aware of this. And one of them that you put in the book is, how can I make this easier?
Exactly. Yeah. And, often when we think about if we're a boss or a business owner or an executive, we view incorrectly our job is telling people what to do and them getting the job done, basically whatever it takes. And, that's okay, but it's a very powerful to ask, how can I make this easier for you? And that's something that many employees have never heard from their boss is, how can I make your job easier? All too often the attitude is, I need you to do your job faster and better, and that's it. And if it's difficult, well, hey, that's why we're paying you. If it was easy and fun, you do it for free. But, when you ask those questions, where do you think you're wasting time in your job? Where do you think you're wasting effort? What is difficult for you to do? When you ask those questions, you can find those friction points and eliminate them in many cases. One project that I saw was consultants. I forget which big consulting company it was. They went to a company to survey them. What are the rules and procedures that are slowing you down? And, if you could get rid of a rule, what would it be? And that itself is a powerful question. But what they found was that many of the rules that people were objecting to were not even rules. It's just that people had been doing them that way and assumed that, well, that was the way we have to do it. And once they saw this, they would, no, that's not a rule. You don't have to do that. It dramatically changed the way things were getting done, made people happier and more productive.
There's a mic drop on that one. My brain is exploding because there's so much that goes into so many unspoken things in company cultures that get passed from one team member to the next about we do it this way because blah, blah, blah. And there's all these rules that aren't rules. And they could really be creating a lot of friction.
Right. And, we see that in security procedures a lot on websites and in apps. Some companies are very good at managing their security, Amazon being one. You are always logged into Amazon on your computer. You'd have to buy a new computer to get logged out of Amazon because when you see that item, they want you to be able to click that one-click buy button and have it on your doorstep in 48 hours. They make it such a frictionless process, and that's why they now have half of all e-commerce, not half of one market, but half of all e-commerce. And they do have security. Though you think, well, gee, maybe they're just lax on security and take a lot of losses. That's not really the case. If you try and engage in a behavior that could be riskier, say I decide to place an order and ship a big screen TV to an address that I haven't shipped anything to before, they are going to re-authenticate me in some fashion. They're going to want my credit card or ask me to re-log in. If I try and send people gift cards, which are just about as good as cash from Amazon, again, they're going to re-authenticate me. But for shipping a product to my home address, they don't do that. But I think in many cases, companies have become very security conscious because they had a breach or they fear a breach, and they've left the decision-making up to a security czar who implements these rules that aren't really rules, they aren't legal requirements, but they feel that either they're necessary to protect the company, or even if they don't protect the company, they can point to it and say, well, hey, we're not liable because we did this and this and this. And that's really a false sense of security. It's much better to do things the way Amazon does than to try and make things really difficult for your customer, log them out every 20 minutes, and crazy things like that just make it very difficult to interact with the business.
Well, and I think that's a really good example of what we were discussing earlier, how if you study the behavior of your best customers and what they are most likely to do, and you can look at how to remove the friction points in that, and then juxtapose that with what are your most difficult clients and customers, or the ones who are going to commit fraud in your business, what are those likely to do? And then put the friction points there to prevent that. And that's what Amazon is essentially doing.
Yeah, I mean, even if you go into your bank, okay, if you want to get into your safety deposit box, there is a relatively high friction procedure that you'll have to go through. You'll probably have to show identification, maybe sign something, maybe even use some other form of like a fingerprint verification, depending on the bank, and then get a key and go into this little room. Pretty high friction process. But, if they've got a box of donuts on the counter as you walk in the bank, they don't have the same procedure for that. They don't really care. If you take 2 donuts, maybe they'll look at you funny, but they don't really care. Where what happens, I think, are businesses say, well, to be really safe, we need to put those safeguards at the front door so that anybody coming in for any reason is going to have to go through those same high friction procedures. And that's where the mistake is made.
I'm just sitting here thinking about a million things. So one of the things my thought was going to what Sabrina was talking about, about the questions as an entrepreneur, to bring up to employees and how to create a less, friction-based environment. And I think, my takeaway on that is that, from my personal experience, I always felt as the business leader that I had to have this, stoic, very strict kind of mindset so that, here's my rules, we're sticking to it. Here's the process, do the process. Don't try to change the process. But over the years, I've learned that, I've gained a lot more through vulnerability and becoming vulnerable. And I think asking those questions, being vulnerable, right, and being open to, if you will, some of it may even be criticism, right? Because if I'm asking my employees, how could I make your job easier? How could I do this? How could I do that? I think, some of the answers from some of the less than A player employees are going to be, somewhat ridiculous. Like, how could I make your life easier? Well, maybe I want to work from home 5 days a week, or I want to work, not at all, and I still want a paycheck. But if you do have some A players that are really giving you some sound feedback, I think if you take those tidbits, but then also keep in the back of your mind the goal, right? And the goal is to create a, less friction for your client, your customer, however you pumpkin plan your business. I think that's a key nugget right there, is to just maintain the focus on the objective of the exercise, and then take the information in and then make those small changes, because, it is kind of overwhelming and it's confusing when we start digging into, I have a business process and now I have to start thinking about taking friction out of it when maybe I put some friction into it for a reason. But at the end of the day, I want to be, least amount of friction as possible for my ideal client.
Probably the greatest CEO of all time was Jack Welch, who took GE on a tremendous ride. He started off with a company that was in pretty good financial shape, but was really bloated. And one of the things that he did, he reduced layers and layers of management, for one. And then after that, he ended up dissolving some of the barriers that kept people from talking to each other. In the old GE, if sales wanted to talk, had a question for manufacturing, that person would have to go up through his own chain of command or her own chain of command, who would then talk to somebody at the higher level in manufacturing and then go down and so on. I said, no, anybody should be able to talk to anybody. And when they started talking to people, and particularly some of their manufacturing workers who had always been in kind of an adversarial relationship with management. Nobody had ever asked them for their opinions or what would help them. And so that was kind of a shock right out of the gate that a big boss would say, well, what can I do to make your job easier? Because the perception had been that, well, these guys are trying to make our lives more difficult, just make us work harder. And they found some amazing things just by doing that, by asking those simple questions. In one case, they found that a machine operator would wear out a pair of gloves, work gloves, every week or two, and would have to get a new pair, go to another building, go through this complex process, get a supervisor to approve a new pair of gloves, and then eventually get back to their machine in their building. And that could take an hour or two every time they needed a new pair of gloves. And the fear was, it's kind of that security question that I was alluding to, that, wow, if we just have gloves around, people will steal them. Nobody ever really looked at the idea that, well, A, are they really going to steal them? And B, if somebody steals a pair of gloves once in a while, does that compare with losing hours and hours of productivity every week? And so they put a box of gloves by the guy's workstation, and they only found that out, though, because, as you said, a big boss was vulnerable enough to go to an hourly worker and say, how can I help you?
That's such a simple question. Such a simple question. But I mean, huge implications. So, Roger, I know that one of the things that you're really well-versed on, as deeply as you've been studying friction, is the impact of removing friction on loyalty. And this is something that we talked about last year at the retreat, because that was the theme, is driving loyalty. Can you share some of that with our audience?
The numbers on what drives loyalty are kind of surprising. One of the things a lot of businesses talk about is creating customer delight. And there's nothing wrong with delighting your customer. It's wonderful. I love it when a business surprises me with something that goes beyond my expectations. But oddly enough, the numbers show that doesn't really drive loyalty and repeat business. There's a study by a company that's now part of the Gartner Group, the big consulting and research group, that looked at drivers of loyalty, and they found that customers who had a high effort experience in resolving a problem were very likely to be disloyal, like 90+% likely to be disloyal. In other words, buy from a competitor the next time, compared with only about 4% who did not have that high effort experience, those who had a low effort experience. And this played out, too, in word of mouth, that people who had these high effort experiences were about 10 times more likely to share that awful experience with others than for a customer that had a low effort experience to say bad things. So, if you can make your processes as low effort as possible, and we talk a lot about the effort involved in just placing an order. And now it's pretty evident that if you make that pretty easy, you'll get more orders, as Amazon has demonstrated. But something that Amazon does that's a little bit less obvious is they make solving problems really easy. For years, mail order companies they try to discourage returns. I was in the mail order business, and I hated returns because you get back merchandise that was damaged, unsaleable. You might have to sell another 5 or 10 of the same product to make back the money you lost on that one item. So mail order companies tried to discourage returns. Amazon makes it super easy to return. The processes are well-defined. You can take a product back to an Amazon locker at various retailers. You can go to UPS, Postal Service. They make it really easy. And many times they'll even say, don't bother returning that. It's too low value. And if you do take a package back through one of these other channels, there's a good chance that by the time you get back to your home or office and fire up your email, you'll have a notification from Amazon saying, hey, we see that you returned that item and we've credited your account. They make it super, super easy to return stuff. And to me, that is one, maybe not quite as obvious reason for their success, but that's important too, because people have the confidence to buy from them knowing that if there is a problem, that it'll be taken care of in a very easy way.
So this is pretty big, because in your book, you make the point that if you have a large competitor, look for where they're creating friction and then resolve that. And we have a lot of listeners who are pumpkin planners. And if you've taken your clients through the wish list interviews in the pumpkin plan, one of the questions is, what do we, in whatever industry you're in, so in my industry it would be coaches and consultants, what do we business coaches and consultants do that drive you crazy? That's getting our clients to talk to us about what the industry does that drives them crazy. And if we can remove those friction points that are disclosed in that conversation, we're going to have our top clients and customers are going to be loyal to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's so important because you can actually ask two questions. If somebody is already a client, you can ask, what are we doing that drives you crazy? Because that's really important to know. But also, if you do have a competitor that you'd like to serve some of their customers, asking that same question for them makes a huge amount of sense, because it could be that there is a pain point that you're not aware of, but in fact, they may not be aware of it because they haven't asked their customers. But once you know that, that's something that you can then use to focus on in your outreach efforts.
Yes.
And eliminate it yourself, of course, for your own processes.
Well, and then the other thing that I think we may not give enough attention to in setting our prices is that customers and clients are willing to pay more for a low friction experience.
Oh, absolutely. I put that to a test a while back because, not in an organized way, but for years here in Texas, Amazon did not charge state sales tax. Eventually, they negotiated a deal with the state and began charging, which for me, an immediate 8% price increase on everything I bought from Amazon.
Wow.
And I expected my behavior to change. I said, okay, I'm going to probably start shopping around more, because for the vast majority of companies that I might deal with, they did not have business location in Texas, and as a result, didn't charge sales tax. What I found was I was truly loyal to Amazon. I kept doing business with them and almost never shopped around for a product, just because it was so easy to do business with them. I had not only is it easy to place orders, I knew it would be easy to resolve problems. And I'll give you an example. My wife just bought a product the other day and had to return it. First of all, the vendor did not refund the shipping on the product, which was probably it was a low value product. So that was like maybe a third of the price of the product. They didn't refund it. But she had purchased it through PayPal, and they have a shipping refund feature that if you pay through PayPal, you can get your shipping back. The process for doing that was so incredibly complex. You had to submit multiple documents. And this was, for under $10 worth of shipping. And it probably took, 30 minutes of fooling around trying to find emails, turn them into PDFs, submit the PDFs, and so on. It's just crazy. And after that, it was like, okay, I'm not going to do this again. I'll just buy it from Amazon.
Yeah. Boy, this has just been such an interesting discussion, Roger. I think Mike and I could talk to you about this for hours.
Well, I can talk about it for hours.
I mean, we're good listeners. It's really hard to ask questions here because I just want to absorb all this. And I know our listeners are going to want to have more from you. So let's talk about how they can learn more from you and be in contact with you. So your book, Friction, is coming out the day after this podcast episode releases.
Right. And that is exciting. So the way you can find me online is probably the best jumping off point is rogerdooley.com. That is where I link to my various other online outlets. I've got a Forbes column. I've got my neuromarketing blog. But that's a good place. And I have information about the book and such there. And also, I'm on Twitter probably more than other social media. So on Twitter, I am at Roger Dooley.
Okay. You have a podcast?
I do, and that is also located at rogerdooley.com, and there is a weekly episode that usually talks to people about marketing or management with a somewhat scientific or evidence-based inclination. Not 100%, but I try and have guests who have data to back up what they're recommending, as opposed to just the fact that they've done something before and it worked for them.
Yeah. So your podcast is the Brainfluence podcast. And what I love about it is, as a psychologist, there's so much human behavior and understanding of just who we are socially and how that drives consumer behavior. I get a lot of that from your podcast. I love that. But like you said, it is backed up by science, and that is unusual. I know you put a lot of effort into creating quality episodes. So I want to acknowledge you for that.
Well, thanks, Sabrina. And I do try and both guests who I think are going to be really informative for my listeners, and then also try and do a good job of preparing. I will typically read the book if they have a book, or read some of their other content if they don't, so that we can at least have an informed discussion.
Well, and I have to say that is something that last year when we were all together at the retreat and you were sharing with Mike and I about your podcast and what you do, that has really been a part of helping us shape this podcast, because I came to really appreciate when you were sharing all of the effort that you go through to prepare for your guests. I came to really appreciate what goes into creating a quality guest experience and a quality listener experience.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sabrina. And, I think there are some podcast hosts who have the attitude that, well, I never read the book because I want to come at it fresh, like I'm one of my listeners who's just going to ask questions and try and probe and bring out key ideas, which, I guess that isn't an invalid way to approach things. But to me, if you have an idea of what this expert is talking about and what kind of things they've worked on, you can definitely bring out more of that than if you're just sort of shooting in the dark, hoping that the conversation goes in a useful direction.
Absolutely. I think it's, for myself, just getting to have this conversation with you today. Mike and I have been looking forward to this ever since we got you signed up for the podcast, because just being able to go deeper from hearing your keynote last year and then having the opportunity to read the book and now getting to talk with you. I think that's the coolest thing about being a podcast host that I've learned. Wouldn't you agree, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is awesome. I actually told my wife this morning, I'm like, we have an awesome guest today, Roger. I met him at the retreat. I was really psyched for that. And yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I love doing. I mean, I love the, genuine conversations and I love helping people. So I know that people are going to there's definitely a lot of aha moments going on for our listeners right now. And Roger, I appreciate your time. It's been great.
Yeah. So I want to say one thing for our listeners. The book Friction is available for purchase. And this is a book that could be a very good team discussion or book club, because as you get your team members reading it, they're going to see more and more places where there's friction that they could help eliminate. And that is going to lead to a lot of good discussion around how do we make things easier around here.
Well, that's great. I do hope that we do see some book club activity, just because I think you're right, Sabrina. It is a topic that when people start talking to each other, I mean, I don't think friction inside an organization, inside a business, is something that one person solves. I think it's solved by people talking to each other and feeding off each other's ideas and energy. So great suggestion. And I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, thank you for being with us, Roger. So everyone, go get a copy of Friction. You will not regret it. It's an awesome book. So Profit Designers, what a treat that was for Mike and I to get to visit again with Roger. Roger was with us at the Breakthroughs on the Bayou retreat a couple of years ago. And I hope that this episode has maybe given you a sense of some of the wonderful conversations that we get into at these retreats. And if you are interested in joining us at our next retreat, check us out at 4weekvacation.com. And by the way, while you're there, download my 4-week vacation jumpstart guide. All of that is available at 4weekvacation.com. Thank you for spending time with us today. Join our conversation in the Profit by Design podcast Facebook group. Share your thoughts on today's episode, ask us questions, and let us know what you want to hear about next. Visit our website at profitbydesignpodcast.com to access resources from our sponsors and tools we've created for you. Subscribe to the show on whatever platform you're listening to right now. There's a subscribe button right there. Go ahead and hit it so that you always get a notification when we release a new episode. And finally, share our podcast with a friend if you know a friend who would enjoy it. Thanks again for listening. This is real life business. Keep your chin up, keep moving forward. You got this.